Hello, everyone. Let me see if I can see participants. Yeah, we've got quite a few. So we still had a few just trickle in. I'm going to wait just a minute because I keep seeing that number go up. All right. Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone this evening. West Valley Water Association has put on this class for you all, and we are very excited to have you with us tonight. We're going to be talking about navigating HOA landscape management and wise water use. Our West Valley Water Organization is a group accumulated of lots of municipalities and private water companies. So you can see a lot of those here. And tonight we're going to have Andrew Peroni from the city of Goodyear discuss our HOA landscape management. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to plop them in the chat. We will answer them as they come along. So let us know if you've got a question and we can take a moment and pause. If you have any issues or problems, you can give me an email at amanda.rothermall@surpriseaz.gov. You will be muted and this session is recorded. We will put this recording up on the West Valley Water Association webpage afterwards. If you need that link, you can again email me or we will be sending that out to you. This program will be about an hour. And we will take questions both during and at the end. So with that, Andrew, I am going to hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everybody this evening. I presume you can see the slides. We can see the slides, okay. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So while I'm presenting and going through this, I will go ahead and turn my camera off, but let us know if you have any issues or you lose connection. So yes, we'll go ahead and get started. So as Amanda mentioned, this is a partnership that we put on together as these West organizations here in the West Valley. But even if you're not from the West Valley, welcome. This is going to be relevant information for you. So we're going to be talking today about landscape management, focus around water, of course. And so we'll be talking about a couple of topics around that. And just to kind of give you a preview of what we're going to be looking at today, want to show you just a little glimpse. Totally kidding. That's way too overwhelming. That's definitely, we're not going to be getting so deep into equations or anything crazy like that. We're going to be talking kind of at a pretty high level of some of these things, but a lot of these things, since you're joining us, you experience a lot of these things on a daily basis related to managing HOAs, living in an HOA and communities. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to first talk about what are some of the challenges that you are likely facing, and maybe what some of your colleagues and counterparts are facing, especially if you are either just a member of an HOA or you're working or you're leading an HOA. We'll talk about water budgets and how they relate to large landscapes, specifically HOA landscapes, how to get to that water information and make good use of it in terms of making decisions. We'll talk about landscapes and some of the technology around there that's out there that can really help in managing a very large landscape and diverse landscapes for efficiency, while also keeping it looking good. We'll touch upon some contractors. Hopefully we have some contractors with us this evening. So we'll kind of talk about what that means in relation to community management and landscaping. We'll touch upon some issues with drought as well. If you've been following the news even passively, you're probably hearing about Colorado River. So we'll talk about that and some strategies that you can take in relation to that proactively. And then specifically, just what does it mean for you as an individual, whether you are helping manage a community, whether you're on a leadership team in a community or a community member or a contractor or even a water provider. We have several of us online with this evening from West Valley. So we'll talk about how we can all work together related to this whole idea of landscape water management. Okay, so let's get started. On the challenges side, what are some of the things that we might encounter? Well, obviously the biggest one is going to be coming to cost. So this is just City of Goodyear water, our 2022 rates. You can see start to get up there pretty high, $9–10 per 1,000 gallon. And if you have a really large landscape, which most HOAs and communities are going to be, then you're talking about some pretty high dollars every single month. And that's just on water costs alone, not even counting other things that could come up, such as maintenance, repair costs, damages due to leaks, things like that. Speaking of leaks, keeping up with leaks can be a big challenge, especially if you have a lot of acreage, a lot of square footage, if you have a lot of areas that are maybe kind of more hidden and people don't really see them all the time. It can be really challenging to find those types of leaks and respond to them in a timely manner. So this is where we can really start to leverage some of the power of water information, water data with relation to your specific communities in order to identify when those things might be happening, especially if they are kind of hidden. So here's a couple examples of what you probably see just all over the neighborhood, whether it's on an actual home or, it's on a part of your community, like that picture on the left there. I like that example. That was actually a main line leak. One of our partners here, and they, once they identified they had the issue, they fixed it right away, but it took quite a while for this to surface. So it was actually hidden underground for several months before we kind of helped them identify, hey, this might be an issue. So a lot of you might be also facing a problem related to technology. This is a really huge one that can be very challenging. And what I mean by technology, well, you could have some more older technology out there. We've been seeing quite a bit of this in, at least in our area in the Southwest Valley. If you recognize these are irrigation controllers that are solar powered. So you see the little solar panels there at the top, which sounds like a great idea initially, maybe kind of a sustainability type initiative. But the problem with that is that these are very challenging to get to and program. They have a very low station capacity, which means you can only run very few zones on them. So if you are trying to manage a very large landscape and you have, let's say, 20 or 30 of these units out there, that's very challenging to be water efficient with this. They also don't have communication capacity via the cloud. So they can't accept any information regarding weather. So that's another big challenge with these out there. So this is just one example of something you might encounter. Additionally, most of our communities in the valley overall are going to have drip irrigation that is watered with like a plastic poly type tubing. If you're lucky enough that you have maybe a PVC lines underground, you might not encounter this type of issue as frequently. But basically, especially if you own a home, you probably experience this as well, that poly tubing becomes brittle and wears out about that 15 to 20 year mark. So think about your specific community and think about how old it is. And if you are right in that range or beyond that, and you haven't necessarily done any big repairs or any big upgrades related to that, you're probably going to be seeing quite a bit of this. Another issue that you might run into is horticultural practices in terms of a challenge that you face. So especially if you are inheriting a landscape, whether you are someone that's been elected to a board or you just moved into the community or you're a contractor, we're all going to be inheriting issues that were happening in the past. And an example, even that picture on the left there, you can see that tree is leaning. So that's a problem, probably from a leak that's been happening a long time. You can also see that the shrubs maybe have been pruned incorrectly, kind of been topped off or trimmed too tightly. So those plants are going to be, probably dying sooner rather than later. And so even if you have the knowledge and you want to, do a good job out there and kind of understand what's going on, if you're inheriting issues like this, that is a big challenge. And this is also a big challenge as a landscape contractor. So if you're working with a contractor, especially if you've hired a new one, these are kind of daily issues that could inhibit proper landscape management or irrigation management. And then this one I think is a very important one that we don't always talk about. So we can go on and on about issues and challenges that you face out in the field, physical issues, and those we can see visibly oftentimes. But communication is a very big challenge with regards to HOAs and communities. So if you feel like you have good communication, if you're on this call, especially if you're on this webinar with other folks from your community, then pat yourself on the back, because you've probably done some good work in building some trust with the other folks that you're working with. But more often than not, we see more situations like this, where it's just really hard for everyone to get on the same page with regards to managing a very large landscape. And what is the big reason for this? Well, different languages are really spoken by different stakeholders. So for instance, we have our property managers, and a lot of times their property managers are really focused on trying to put out the fires. There's a lot of things that are coming up that are emergencies or almost emergencies. And it's, okay, how do we mitigate these future fires and keep the ship afloat? And so there's a lot of times, even if there's really good intentions, it's hard to get around to these kind of long-term or vision type of things, long-term planning and management, because there's just so many fires that are happening on a daily basis from all sides. As a board member, you're really looking a lot at the dollars, I would imagine, because you're really looking at, okay, assessments. We want to keep the community nice, but we don't want to spend excessively. We need to make sure that we have a good amount in our savings. The biggest question that's always coming up, are we going to need to raise dues? Are we going to need to raise dues to cover water costs that are outside of our control, or landscape maintenance costs? It is a big decision to make when upgrades are recommended, right? Or hey, we need to do this big repair, or this repair is just the beginning of a bigger issue. That's a really hard decision to make. And as a board member, there's always those dollars that are kind of floating around there, trying to keep the community solvent, if you will. As a contractor, landscape contractor, they're really speaking the language of horticulture. So their focus is about, they throw these words around like irrigation uniformity, or drip emitters and valves, pump capacity, or overseeding, all these terms that if you've been a member of a community or a board member for a while, a property manager, you might start to get a hang of. But if you're fairly new into that world, or even if you've been around that world for a while, but it's a lot of horticultural language, right? And as a landscape contractor, they're really trying to do everything to keep that community looking nice. But it's hard for a lot of contractors, in my experience, to communicate what needs to be done in a language that is understandable by decision makers. Then we have our residents. And I think we have some people who are maybe not in either of these positions, but they're just residents of a community and trying to get a sense of, why am I seeing what I'm seeing? What is going on behind the scenes here? Or what's happening. And a lot of times residents, it's just kind of, it's anything that's on their mind, they'll kind of try and communicate. A lot of times it's related to issues. A lot of times it's related to something that's kind of could be more of emotional, especially if it's a very personal thing. And so this is the balance that we're all trying to, as if you're running a community or part of a HOA community, this is a lot going on, right? And it's not all necessarily on the same page. And this is where really, as water agencies and cities, this is part of our role, is to help assist in bringing all of you as individuals together to work towards that common goal, which is really streamlining for both water efficiency and for dollar efficiency. Really want to, make sure that the dollars that you are spending, whether as a resident or as a leadership on the board, is effective. And that's where we can help with some of the data. That's what we're going to talk about next. So with regards to landscape water budgets, this is where we really start to talk about how do we utilize water data in order to make sure that we're on the right track and keeping everybody on this same, the ship steered in the right direction. So let's talk briefly about what is a landscape water budget. We'll talk a little bit about numbers. I won't go in too deep, but just because it's important to understand for maybe not necessarily if just in passing, but if you are actively managing a community, this is important to understand. So what is landscape water budget? When we think of budget, we oftentimes think of dollars, and it's kind of similar to that. But let's talk briefly about just landscapes in general. So this is kind of your typical landscape picture. You got your plant, and it's either, and it's using water through that word on the left, evapotranspiration. The word itself is not as important as just understanding that the plant loses water through leaves and through the soil. So we need to replace that water somehow. So we're going to replace, and we need to know how much water did the plants use? How much did the plants in the lawn use each month of the year? Because that's how we program our water needs. That's how we identify how much water a landscape needs. So in Arizona, our amount of inches lost in evapotranspiration is about 75 inches per year. And the only reason I bring that up is just because it's very high, and I do like to compare it to our rainfall. Our rainfall is only about 1/10 of that. And this is the biggest reason why in Arizona we need irrigation for the most part in our urban landscapes. It doesn't mean that all plants need irrigation. You can look at the hills surrounding us in the West Valley, the White Take Mountains, Estrella Mountains, and there's still plants on there, right? But those are not in an urban environment. And they also go drought dormant, which is not necessarily what we want for our urban landscapes and our communities that we live in. So that big discrepancy has to be replaced somehow, and that's where irrigation comes in. So this is where we have to figure out, okay, well, how much irrigation? It seems like a lot just looking at these numbers, comparing them. Those other two things on there I'm going to call out briefly because they're important in managing landscape water on large landscapes. And that first one is surface runoff. So any water that's put on the soil, whether it is rain or it's irrigation water, but we have more control over the irrigation water. If it doesn't get into the soil and just gets over the top of the soil and off, and that's wasted dollars, wasted money or wasted water, excuse me, because it's applied, it's paid for, but it didn't actually do its job. Additionally, deep percolation kind of sounds like a good thing, right? It's like, oh, we'll put some water in the groundwater. That's not really entirely true in the West Valley. We have a lot of aquifers that are very deep, 1,000 feet, maybe more. So just overwatering a landscape doesn't really help our aquifers. It's kind of like leaving your windows open with the air conditioning on in your house. And you're like, well, yeah, technically you're cooling the outside, but really you're not, right? It's not making an impact that way in any positive way. So the biggest thing is actually to irrigate to the point where you're not losing water past the root zone. So the next thing we need to know is how much do these plants and lawn need in my specific community? So that comes down to a couple factors. So if, for instance, 75 inches is what we need, this is, I promise, the only little bit of math here. I just want to show you a comparison of the different plant types. So why is it that we talk so much about lawn? Well, a lawn that is overseeded with winter grass, and right now you're probably already past the point where you've made the decision to either overseed or not. We'll talk about that later on. It needs about 70% of that 75 inches. So that's a pretty high number as compared to a lawn that's not overseeded, only needs about 60%, and that's only during the growing season, which would be only summer. So in the wintertime, that number drops down to about 10%. And desert plants and trees use about 30%. So you can see more or less, the reason I call these numbers out, if you're a contractor, you're probably familiar with these numbers. If you're a property manager or a community member, board letter, the numbers are not as important as the comparison. So look at desert plants and trees. It's about half of the water need related to lawn. And that's why we talk about why do we plant desert plants instead of lawn in certain areas. That's the reason why. And if you have cacti, which is basically your toughest of the tough, that's only about 10%. So that's your really, really low water use. So if you're talking about what is the things that need almost little to no supplemental irrigation through an irrigation system, that's what we're going to be talking about is almost your really true natives. Now, sometimes it needs a little bit of irrigation supplemented because, again, our urban landscapes have a different environment than the natural landscapes, a little bit tougher environment for plants. But overall, you could see the difference there. So let's bring this all together. We talked about our plant types. That's the first thing you need to know. The second thing you need to know is how much area is being irrigated. So think about your specific community. If you haven't already done this, I would encourage it or work with your water provider to do it. And that's to get some kind of map with square footage. You want to know how much area are you actually irrigating? Not necessarily how much area are we maintaining, like how big is our community, because there might be areas that are maintained but not irrigated. You really need to know how much area is actually being irrigated. And this is kind of that equation that brings everything together. So that budget is what we need. That's the number we need to know as a community to understand how much water and money it's going to take to keep our landscape looking good. So percent is basically just, this is the plant type. That's what we talked about before. That's saying what kind of plants do we have. ETO minus rain, that's our weather. So we take our plant type, we take our weather, combine those two with our landscape size. And those three factors combine to give you your total budget or your total expected water use for your community. If you're not as familiar with all of these types of terms, don't worry. This is where we, as kind of your water providers, whether we're a private water company or public water agency, we can help you to get this information so you can have somewhere to start. But it's so important. And why is it important? Well, in order to understand how much water you actually need for your specific community, is the baseline to understand if you're already watering well or not. So the reason is because, as you probably know, landscape irrigation costs a lot of money. The water itself can be tens of thousands of dollars or more, depending on how big your community is. And that's just the water costs. We talked as well about repair costs. So that could be water lost from leaks. So let's say you had a leak that was an extra 100,000 gallons. Well, you're still paying the water costs on that 100,000 gallons, even though it actually wasn't effective in watering your landscape. And then anytime you have too much water going to the landscape, you might have some excessive plant growth. So now you have some additional maintenance costs, right? You might have some overgrowth on pathways or other areas where they start to become an obstruction. And it's like, man, these are desert plants, they seem really happy and they're growing like crazy. Well, that's not super common for desert plants. So if you have that, it might be an indication that there's some overwatering happening in certain areas. And of course, plant replacement costs. Now, this could be due, we see quite a bit of this in our large communities, that they could be dying from overwatering or from rot. They could also just be dying from over pruning, and we'll talk about that later on. So desert plants don't really like to be pruned that much. So if they're getting pruned every month or every 2 months, they're going to have a much shorter lifespan than desert plants that are getting pruned once a year or twice a year. And just to kind of bring this point home in terms of, well, I'll throw one more other point on here too. Tree liability. So this could be a big thing if you have a community that's maybe a little bit older. You get that benefit of having those really big, nice, mature trees, but you also have that liability that now these trees are really big, and if they fall, it's going to cause some pretty severe damage. Now it's about, where are they near? Are they near some community walls? Are they near someone's home? So now do we need to pay money to remove them, even though we like them? So this is a lot to be managing. And if, especially our desert trees, if they get overwatered, that's a lot of times when you'll see those ones come crashing down in a storm, if they've been overwatered for a lot of years. So repair costs as well, it's very difficult to know how to budget for those. If we're watering the amount of water that we expect to be watered, then that's a little bit more manageable for budgeting, even if water costs are going up each year, rather than we need to have this amount because we don't know if we're going to have some kind of huge capital project or upgrade to prevent further damage from leaks or from plant death. And I'll just make one other note that, an example community, just kind of talking again about the dollars, that first point, the water cost. We have kind of a small size community in Goodyear, and our water costs are a little bit on the higher end. And they're expected to use, they only have one lawn area. They've removed their other lawn areas, and they still, if they watered perfectly, would need 2.4 million gallons for calendar year 2022. And that would cost them about 30 grand annually. And that's at perfect water efficiency, no leaks, no issues, watering right on target. Those are some pretty big numbers. So that's why this is important. So before I move on to the next one, which is accessing water info, I'll go ahead and pause. And Amanda, do we have any questions that you'd like me to discuss here?
Yeah, so we have one question that says, what is the best way to find out if my HOA has done these sorts of calculations?
Excellent question. Stay tuned. We're going to be talking about that coming up.
Alrighty, and then there was one earlier when you were talking about controllers, and the question is, they would love to hear ideas on how large communities have added rain sensors to Hunter water controllers that are 15 years old. Do you have to replace them, or can you add sensors to existing controllers? So that goes back a few slides.
Okay, that's a good question. I think it's going to come up on our point down below where it says landscapes and technology. So yes, I'll go ahead and address that when we get to that one, but that's a great question. Yes.
And one last question before you move on. Does the city of Goodyear require the HOA to plant particular trees?
That's a good question. Every city and it typically comes down to the city you live in. Even if you have a private water company providing water to your community, it usually is the city's ordinances or laws that dictate the types of plants that are required in when the community is constructed, or required plant densities that are supposed to be maintained. So most cities are going to have some general requirement of minimum plant densities. Is it really enforced? I would say that's not typical. You're not usually, unless there's a community that's gone just wall to wall rock and no plants. That's about the only time you'll maybe have someone from the city knocking on your door about what plants you have and where they're at. If you're an established community, typically all that stuff gets taken care of when the community is built. And yes, in those cases, there are usually certain types of trees that are either recommended or just straight up allowed or not allowed. The place that we usually point to is there's something called the Arizona low water use plant list, and it's through the State Department of Water Resources. So many cities will reference that list in their code or in their design guidelines when they are recommending plant materials that should be used. So that question could kind of go a lot deeper. So I'll stick around afterward if somebody has more questions on that. Or more questions related specifically to Goodyear. Anything else, Amanda?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So great questions so far. Thank you for your engagement and your questions. And yeah, if I don't answer any of those that I said I would at the end, feel free to re-ask them, and I will definitely do that. So let's talk about how do you get this water info? And this is kind of to that one person who asked this question of how do we know if this is already happening? Well, you need to be able to access water information in order to establish that baseline. So how do we get that? Well, if you're a property manager, then you are technically the account holder of that water. And so I would encourage you, if you don't already have this, to reach out to your water provider. Typically, your water conservation team is going to be a good place to start, because this is really a big part of our jobs, is to help you with getting that water data. And the reason it's property managers is because Arizona law has some privacy laws around water data. And so the account holder has to be the one to say it's okay to share that with other people, whether it's a board or a contractor or even a community resident. We have to get permission as water providers from the account holder. And in most cases, that's going to be the property management company. So that's going to be the best place to start. If you're a board member or a landscaper, talk with your property manager. Encourage them to reach out. You can also reach out to your water provider if you have that contact already, and kind of bring everybody to the table. But we do need the permission of the property manager in order to start sharing this information and getting it out there. And if you're a resident, one of the best things you can do to start is to be those eyes and ears for early leak detection. So oftentimes, board members, they might have time to walk around their community. Property managers usually don't have time to do a lot of walks. They can as much as they can, but they're managing several communities. So as a community resident, if you want to make an impact from the very beginning, is being eyes and ears out there and identifying some things that you might see that other people may not see, right? Maybe you frequent that random street and random corner that's maybe kind of not really frequented by anybody else. And if you see water that seems to be piling up over there, you might actually be the first one to notice that. So I would encourage you to kind of do that, even if you don't necessarily aren't able to see access to the aggregated water data. But this is where you're already doing the right thing by attending this webinar, by getting an understanding of the big picture on water use, so that if you hear about at a board meeting, or not a board meeting, but a community-wide meeting about how much water costs, then you can start to understand what's going on with relation to your community. And I think one of the most important impacts you can make as a community resident, because we see this over and over and over again, and I know a lot of my colleagues and our water providers see this, is understanding about desert landscapes and how they thrive. Because a lot of times we'll hear from contractors and managers of really large communities that we have to water excessively, we have to trim excessively, because that's what our residents want. So as a resident, you have the power to say, no, this is not what I want. I want our desert landscapes to thrive in the way that they're meant to. And that's something you can have a really big impact on because they're listening to you, you're the voting member. So I would encourage that. And we'll talk about some other strategies later on as well. Yeah, so that's kind of the intro in terms of accessing. I'm just looking at my notes. I had one other point I was going to make, that a lot of times the reason why our large landscapes can appear to be, or can be in actuality, wasting resources is because we're putting way too many inputs into them that are not required. Whether it's way too heavy maintenance, way too heavy watering, where cutting back on both of those things sometimes can actually help our landscapes to look better, and we're saving a bunch of money in the process. Okay, so let's talk about the actual data here. To get the landscape water budget, remember what we needed. We needed the landscape area, and then we need the water data. And what this is going to do is going to compare the actual water use each month to the expected water use each month. And this is what that looks like, just kind of in a simple chart. There's two charts here. They're doing essentially the same thing. Just depends on your water provider, which one they have available. The one on the left is, you can see the blue band is, the blue line is actual water use. The green is expected water use. And the green, you can see, is an actual broad band because it's a range, because landscape irrigation is imperfect. It's very, very difficult to get an exact number every single month. So typically what we recommend is getting within a range, a 15% range. You can see plus or minus 15% down there on the bottom. That's really what your target is if you're managing a large landscape. And the larger the landscape, the larger those actual gallon swings are going to be, right? So even at this example here, 1.2 million gallons is what that number is showing. So even if you're right on target, or you're even just a little bit above, it could be an extra 100,000 gallons. And we would still look at that and say, nope, you're still doing really good because you're within that band. So the scale of a landscape can really impact the quantity of the water. And the one on the right, the difference between the two, the one on the left is showing live weather in terms of whether that happened in a specific year. The one on the right is a historical average. Both of them are going to get you pretty close. Remember, the scale that we're working at here is very large. So even if we have a hotter or a colder year, because we're looking at historical averages and we're looking at monthly data, you're still going to be trying to shoot for the same range. So if you're way too far out the range, you'd say, well, we have 20% additional water. Well, was it 20% hotter? Yeah, typically not, right? It was 115 instead of 110. Yeah, that's pretty hot. Did put stress on the plants, but that's not 20% hotter, right? So just something to keep in mind in doing landscape management. So like I mentioned, the one on the left is real-time weather, and then the one on the right, historical. So it just depends on what your water provider has, but both are great to get started. So once you have this information for your specific community, then we need to identify what's our goal. So we can start here and look at a graph like this and look at all these numbers, and it's like, okay, that's kind of a lot of stuff. Like, what am I looking at here? What do I really need to know in order to know if we are on the right track? Well, the first thing is just taking a quick look at that graph. How close is the blue line to the green line? And then you can use that. So here again, the blue line is our water use. That's the one we have control over. The green one is one you don't have control over. That's just based on your landscape size, and it's based on the weather. And when we talk about water budget, this is not the city or a water agency coming at you and saying, if you have to keep to this or you're going to get in trouble. These are all just information to help you to get as close as you can be to the expected water use. And if you're not, then it gives you a sense of, oh, we maybe have an opportunity for some changes. So overall, the biggest thing you want to take away from this is this number right here. And this is, what are we at in comparison to our landscape water budget? So your goal is to be 115% or below. So basically that's, if 100% is right on target, then you want to be at 115% or below, because that means that we only applied 15% additional water or less for a whole year over our landscape. And that we would consider excellent water management. And the larger the landscape, it's really hard to manage quite a bit of square footage. So that is really the number you're going to want to take home with you once you've done your analysis. And I say you've done the analysis. Once we've helped you do the analysis as water providers, this is the number that we're all really looking at here. And we'll talk about later on why this can also be important. Once you have that, now you can say, okay, well, now we nearly know where we need to save water. So think about your specific community, even if you don't have that number in your head yet. These are some of the strategies that you can start to take once you know where you stand. So we have our annual number. That's the one we looked at, right? So for instance, on the one we looked at before, 148%, we would say, okay, we have a good 20 to 30% of water per year that we can likely save, just based on trying to get a little bit closer to our water budget. Then you break it down a little further, there's monthly. And that could be related to catching leaks. That could also just be related to programming, adjusting the watering schedules promptly. Oftentimes what we'll see, again, going back to some technology issues, is there's a delay in response to weather. The weather happens, and then the contractor has to run out there and make a bunch of changes. So we see a delay in how quickly the watering schedule is adjusting to the weather. So that could be a challenge, but there's a lot of opportunities for savings there. On the leak side, one of the things you can do that's very powerful as a leadership is taking a look at your water meters. And what I mean by that is find out if your water agency utilizes any real-time data on the water meters. We often call that in our industry AMI, which is just advanced metering. All it means is there's a higher resolution of water information. It could be daily, it could be hourly, but it's going to give you a much better insight into faster leak detection. And if not, if your water provider doesn't offer that, and it's not really on any kind of near-term future radar, and you still want to do that, consider working with your landscape contractor to install devices that can do the same thing. There are lots of devices out there that can monitor real time for leak detection. So you can sit from your computer, log in every day as a board member or community manager and see, okay, are any of them spiked up? Did any of them run all night long when they shouldn't have? You could take care of those leaks really quickly that way. Referencing the scheduling, one of the things that I wanted to mention on that, and we'll touch upon this a little bit more as well, is our controllers managed according to the weather. So what I mean by that is, let's go back quickly just to this slide. You can notice on some of these months, look back kind of in this area here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you can look over here and identify, okay, well, you can kind of see they were trying to make some changes to the irrigation, but this is an indication that they just weren't really able to change it quickly enough, or they weren't really changing it frequently enough. And this is where you might decide, okay, maybe we actually need a better controller management system. Whereas if you maybe look, we don't have an example on this screen here, but if you were keeping, let's say you were up here, but you were keeping really close to the green band, but you were just high above it, you would say, okay, well, we're actually making adjustments to the irrigation at the right interval. We have another issue going on, maybe a hidden leak that's elevating all of our water use. And another thing to keep in mind is, let's say you're really close to the green band, right? You get your data and you're like, wow, we're actually doing really good every month. Then having a smart controller installed on your system, which is what I was going to mention, is not really going to accomplish for you right away what you are thinking it's going to accomplish, right? It's not necessarily going to save you water, because a smart controller, what it's essentially trying to do is get you closest to that green band as possible. Every single month, every single day, it's trying to match your landscape as close as possible to the expected water use. If you have a contractor that's already doing that for you without smart controllers, then it's just something to really consider if it's a really costly upgrade. Now, it might be a good idea to do anyway if your system is aging out and you're like, hey, they're doing a good job, but really these things we have old technology, it's not going to last. Then you might decide it anyway, right? But just something to consider that that we don't really have a magic bullet piece of equipment that's going to take care of water management. It's going to be ongoing, whether you have smart system or not, to take care of your landscaped areas. So the biggest thing is having a contractor that knows how to manage irrigation and irrigation scheduling. And we'll talk about that in our next area when we talk about, or I guess in two areas when we talk about contractors. In terms of the types of landscape, and I know we had some questions related to technology, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth here. What are some specific strategies? So let's say we've gotten our first steps down. We got our baseline water budget. We know how much water we are using. We know how much opportunity we maybe have for savings. We've identified that maybe there's a little bit of leaks. There's maybe a little bit of irrigation controller management we need to do. So what are some more specific in-depth things that we can do? Well, irrigation maintenance is a huge one. And when we talk about that, we talk about some of the hardware that's in ground. Like anything, it wears out. So if we haven't done any kind of irrigation hardware maintenance for the equipment in the ground, or there's not really a plan in place, or it's a little bit more reactive, even though that stuff is meant to last quite a long time, some of it, a really tough sprinkler head might even last you 40 years. If your community is already 25 years old, maybe it's time to start thinking about what are we going to do about upgrading in the long term, or phasing something like that. Same with our drip lines, we've talked about that. It's just a good idea to maybe start thinking about working with your contractor, having a plan in place so that you don't end up at a place where everything's breaking at once and it's just too much to handle. Software, this is the controller side, or the timer side, you'll sometimes hear it called. This is where the irrigation management really comes in. But it is, the actual units themselves can be wearing out. They could also have capabilities that are really not that great, like we talked about earlier. So the question you want to ask is your system really maximized as it stands? Oftentimes, we'll get approached, or I'll get approached by community members who have concerns. A lot of times, board members or property managers who are saying, we're getting recommended that we need to redo our whole system, and we have to do all new controllers. We have to do, and so the first question I ask them is, well, what do you have, and is it already being maximized? Is what you have there already? Can it accomplish what you're trying to do in order to save water? Some of the things that this could come up related to are things like water pressure management. So oftentimes, if you have a community that uses pumps, especially if you have lakes, this is going to be an integral part. Do you have someone who can really manage your pumps? And a lake, especially, we won't even talk about lakes in this one, but lake management is a whole other thing as well. But if you have pumps, especially, that has a lot to do with water pressure. That can also have a lot to do with strain on your irrigation system and how often things break. So really take a close look at your pump and pressure management. Do you have proper drip emitters that are out there? Are they watering at an appropriate output for the plants? Because if not, then you're going to be getting quite a bit of issues where some plants are getting more water, some plants are getting less water. And then controllers. So this is always kind of a popular one because it's kind of the brains of the system. But one thing that I always encourage is, let's take a close look at the controller that you have already, or the controllers that you have out there already, especially if your community is on the newer side. In one example, we had a community here that in Goodyear that was only a couple years old, and they were already getting recommended to tear out everything and upgrade their whole irrigation timer system to make it smart. And then when we went out and kind of took a look at the system, they could have accomplished that by just swapping out a panel on their existing controller to make it smart. And then also they have what's called a 2-wire system. And the reason that's relevant is because not all controllers, even smart controllers, are capable of operating a 2-wire system. So they could have put something in, so like, oh, now nothing's turning on. Like, okay, well, why? Well, because it's not compatible with your your hardware that you had out there. So just, something to be cognizant of before making any big decisions on upgrades. Not to say that they're bad decisions or that they shouldn't be made, because they can be appropriate, but just something to really consider, that to make sure your system's being maximized. Rain sensors, we had a question about this earlier. I don't know if the person was referring specifically to rain sensors or to weather sensors as a whole. So for example, if you have that system you mentioned, Hunter controllers, even if they're on the older side, most controllers, almost any controller, can have a simple rain sensor attached to it. And the rain sensor, all it does is when rain hits that sensor, it pauses the irrigation. It doesn't change any program. It doesn't disrupt anything. It just pauses any irrigation that's scheduled for that day or the next day. And then once it dries out, then the system just kind of keeps running again. It's appropriate in some cases, not necessarily all cases, but it is appropriate in a lot of cases. And if you have a really, really large landscape with a lot of acreage, this is a really cost-effective way to save yourself big bucks if you have old controllers, because just one day of skipping for rain might save you, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 if that's kind of the amount of water you're looking at. And you might have a system that's too old where the contractor just cannot realistically run out there and turn off 25 controllers on a day just to have to come back in 2 days and turn them all back on. So that's where this can work. And if you're using a basic rain sensor, that is compatible with most controllers. Tree and shrub maintenance, we've touched upon this a little bit, specifically related to over trimming. We just see this so frequently out there. This puts strain on the plants. It increases their water demand and shortens their life. New plants as well take on new water. Take on additional water. So let's say these plants were trimmed really heavily and they're like, oh, now they're dead. We got to replace them. Okay, well, when we replace them, now we have to have an establishment schedule on that zone, regardless of any other plants on the zone, and that also increases your water use. So it's kind of this ripple effect that can happen. So if you're seeing a lot of this in your community, especially if you're noticing a lot of blooms are sitting on the sidewalk and not on the plant, just something to consider, have a discussion with your contractor. And a lot of times they might be doing it on instruction. So really just have that honest conversation, identify really what you'd like your landscape to look like. But if you do want it to look like the beer cans, as we say, the beer can landscape that are all very neat and tidy and pruned with very specific shapes, that's going to have a much higher water demand. So just something to keep in mind. Your watering depth, this is very important as well in terms of a specific strategy. We really want to make sure that you're watering your plants as deeply as you can, as deeply as the system allows. And that's because the deeper roots are going to be much more resilient to drought and water shortages. So if you have even regardless of anything like a restriction, if you have a problem in that zone, let's say the zone stopped turning on, you're not going to lose every plant on the zone right away because they're going to have a nice deep root system. And it also saves water in the long run because you're not applying water on the soil surface so frequently that could just evaporate. Drip emitter placement. This happens quite a bit, especially if your community is even as little as 5-10 years old. The plants grow pretty quickly, and you have a lot of drip emitters that are right next to the trunks of the plants and the trees. And the plants don't really take up water right there. That's more structural, and too much water there for too long. That's when you'll see down trees. That's when you'll have rot, leaning trees, all sorts of things like that. You really want to move those drip emitters further out away from the plants in the long run in order to sustain that, that health for the plants, because that's where they're taking up the water. We talked about drip emitter placement. This is kind of a visual example of what looks like if that doesn't happen. You can see there's eventually that valve got stuck on here in this case, and that tree was really just drowning. You can see in other times where you might not have the right type of drip emitter, or you can have some leaks that are causing some early death if you have too much water in the wrong areas. So just something to kind of take a look at and a little more closely. As a landscape management strategy that's a little more proactive. Lawn maintenance. So this is a big topic of conversation right now. Now, the best thing you can do if you have a lot of acres of lawn, or any acres of lawn really, is to manage it as best you can, regardless of whether you just are deciding, well, we might remove it, we might not. There's still some key strategies right now with what you have that you can do to make sure that your lawn is water efficient. One of the big things that you hear about is, should we overseed with a winter grass? So that's always a decision that's up to the community, community leadership, depending on your characteristics. Now, one thing you could decide if you say, well, we don't really want to overseed everything, it's so expensive, if nothing else. What you can do is identify certain areas that maybe you want to overseed and other areas that you don't. So what we typically see, or encourage, if you haven't thought about this already, and if you are doing this, then kudos to you, is to have a rotational plan for your overseeding. So even if we're probably going to overseed something, think about having like a 3-year cycle where every lawn area that's overseeded is overseeded maybe only once every 3 years. And that gives you the savings on the dollar side from the seed and the water costs, but it also gives you a little bit healthier Bermuda grass in the summer. Putting a winter grass on top of Bermuda grass is really stressful on the Bermuda grass, the summer grass. So that's when you'll often see where the lawn gets really patchy in late June and early July. It's like, man, it's just because it's hot. Well, not necessarily. The summer grass likes it when it's hot, but if it was battling the winter grass all the way until May, now it didn't have a chance to get in the sun to grow really nice and thick. And that's just because it was battling the winter grass. They were competing. So in order to keep your soil health and your lawn health long-term, consider doing something more rotational. If you're thinking of doing some removal of areas, consider the ones that are underutilized. So if you're saying, well, we're already close to our water budget, and yet we still want to be lower, we still want to lower our costs. Well, that's when you start considering things like changing your physical landscape, because we can't really impact the weather, and we can't really impact the plant need in terms of what they require, but you can change out your areas that you're irrigating. You can change it into something from high water use to low water use, and that's where you can make an impact. Any areas that are shaded under a lawn consistently, really kind of consider those and what you want to do with them long term. Having the benefit of a really large tree is great, but as you've probably noticed, if you've been out in your community, it's really hard to grow summer grass under those trees. So you kind of end up getting a little bit of a mud pile, really patchy lawn. And so if that's an area you don't want to get rid of a really large, nice mature tree, then consider maybe those are the areas where you might say, okay, well, maybe consider taking out some lawn in those areas. Now, this picture on the right, we can't quite do it in this webinar, and I'm also kind of talking quite a bit, so we don't have as much time. Oh, sorry, one last point, aeration. If this is not something that's part of your strategy for managing lawn, definitely would encourage that. If you are experiencing things such as when we water the lawn, we have a lot of water that just sits on the soil and doesn't soak in, even if you have the proper schedule, that could indicate that the lawn hasn't been aerated for quite some time. And that can happen on areas that have maybe high traffic, but it can happen in areas that are more passive as well, if they're more like a basin where the soil just got compacted over time. We tend to have a little bit more clay or clay loam soil, and it can be subject to compaction. So if you're having those areas of your lawn where you're just not getting that penetration of the water down into the root zone, consider working with your contractor to get that aerated, and that's going to help long-term for water efficiency as well, because the water you're applying is then getting into the roots. So just take a quick look at this picture and maybe think about your community as well, and think about the different lawn areas that you have, and maybe especially those lawn areas that just never really seem right, or they never really look that good. Consider what we've heard and talked about today, what might be the reason for that. So what challenges do you see here? So if I do this in person, I'd kind of pick on anybody and maybe throw them a piece of candy. But since we are virtual, I will just kind of run through a few things that you can notice. The first thing is this area is going to be a pretty high water use lawn area. Now, why is that? Well, number one, you could tell from this picture, it looks like they overseeded it, right? So, okay, so that was a decision that was made, which is fine, but it did increase the water use there. Second thing you can see is these elevation changes. We have these low areas over here on the left, and then it kind of curves up a bit. So that makes it really difficult when we're trying to irrigate these areas, because the water is not, it might land evenly, but it's not gonna soak in that instant, and now it's gonna all puddle in different areas of low elevation. So that's very difficult, especially these slopes right here. It's very, very difficult to keep those irrigated. So what ends up happening, and especially you kind of see here, you're going to end up overwatering the basins, because you're going to have to keep these edges green. So to keep these edges green, you have to water them quite a bit. They're pretty exposed. Any additional water that fell off of that slope is going to just pond in here. So it's a very challenging area to keep watered. So as a result, it's going to have a higher water use than other lawn areas. Next thing is high exposure. So this is a pretty high exposure area. You have a lot of reflected heat around here with the walls and the rock. Additionally, you have curves. Now, curves could be very nice in a pastoral landscape design, but irrigation doesn't work that way. Irrigation works in straight lines. And so you end up, in order to keep these areas around the curves green, you end up watering the rock by its very nature of irrigation systems. So some things to consider. The other thing that can maybe impact some decisions of how you want to manage, or even just if you want to overseed, is say, okay, well, this area is most likely going to be more of a passive recreation lawn area. So that's maybe an area where we really consider if, maybe we have an active or really heavily used area that we don't want to prioritize. Okay, before I move on to the contractors, I want to open it up again for any other questions. So Amanda,
yes, we have them kind of in a few places, so bear with me. So we have a question that says, when removing turf around established trees, what can be done to minimize damage to the tree roots?
Yeah, that's a great question. You definitely want to consider your trees when you're removing lawn. I won't get too much details here. I would definitely work with your landscape contractor on that plan to make sure that there's a plan in place for those. Removing Bermuda grass lawn requires chemical. There's really not any other way around. I mean, there are some other ways around it, but it's not really anything. It's too long term for a HOA to use, such as, you know, I'll cover it all with plastic for 4 months. Like, that's just not going to happen. So you're going to use chemical, and the chemical too much of it can damage the trees. So that's something to kind of work with your contractor and figure out what's our best strategy here for established trees. Additionally, if you're removing irrigation from lawn, which you're usually going to do if you're replacing it with desert trees and shrubs, you're going to want to put in quite a bit of irrigation around that tree. So not just 2 drip emitters, you're going to want to put, you know, quite a bit, maybe even consider like well, I won't get into specific hardware, but basically you're going to want to water those trees really deeply, because those roots are going to be pretty expansive, and that tree has a pretty high water need after being in the lawn for that amount of time. So what we'll sometimes see with trees is they won't react right away, but then 3 years later, the tree will decline and then die. And it's because its water got cut off and it wasn't ever really replaced. So you're going to want to water that established tree really well after the lawn's been removed. And yeah, definitely have some considerations around the amount of chemical that's used in order to remove the lawn. But without using chemical, that lawn's always just going to kind of be hanging out there, which may be a consideration, right? They might say, let's just kind of mulch the area around an established tree, and that will prevent any old Bermuda grass from trying to pop through, because there's just going to be no sunlight there. So there's some strategies to do, but yes, I would definitely say it's important to consider your established trees when removing lawn underneath them. Good question.
Okay. And then we have a few questions that deal with landscape, so I'm going to try to kind of lump them together.
Okay.
So asking, what are the best types or good types of landscape for sloped areas, rain runoff areas, washes, that sort of thing?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, sloped areas, a lot of us have them, especially because there's a requirement to have basins in order to capture a certain amount of stormwater. And so you're going to have sloped areas in most communities. Typically, your desert trees and shrubs could do a pretty good job with that. You could also consider some desert related ground covers, and then you can kind of get the best of both worlds, where you get a little bit more of that full look without having a ton of additional water use. So what I would encourage you to go to, there's a site, and I can throw it in the chat here. It's amwa.org/plants, and there's quite a bit of information there on plants that can work for slopes. And there's a ground cover section in there as well. So I would encourage you to check that out and see which plants might fit your community aesthetic. But ground covers, there are some more bushy ones. There's also some lower growing ones that can do pretty well here, that can help to hold those slopes. And so they're not just bare and rock. But also a lot of our desert trees and plants can actually do a pretty good job of just kind of growing on that slope and stabilizing it without a lot of additional water. Good question.
And then, is the city of Goodyear looking at implementing mandatory water conservation programs for HOAs? And it looks like an example, if you have X number of acres of turf, you can't use more than so many gallons. Are you going to be mandating a water budget, is what it sounds like?
That's a good question. I have not heard any communities, Goodyear included, that's going to be doing anything around mandates for water budgets. Will there be anything related to droughts? We're going to talk about that in one of our next sections here, so stand by for that. But in terms of, hey, because you have this amount, you have to stay within this, that's not a discussion. Everything right now that I've seen and that's on the radar is still voluntary. So the fact that you all are here is great, because it's showing that you have that ability to do that without having something that's required. So yeah, in short, I haven't heard anything along those lines. I can only speak really for Goodyear, but I haven't also heard that from anybody else. So I would say, in terms of being concerned about getting hit with a fine for watering more than your allocation, the only time that would come up is if you are reporting to the State Department of Water Resources. So if you are a part of a really large community, that has over 30 acres of turf, you are, or your property manager is likely submitting paperwork to the State Department of Water Resources every year about how much water was used on that area. And the state, in theory, does have the ability to fine people who are overwatering for too long, but they typically don't do that right away. They'll usually, let you know that it happened, and then, try to connect you to some resources and stuff. So I wouldn't be too worried about that specific thing at this moment in time.
Okay. And then a couple more, and I will also answer questions in both the chat and the Q&A. But I want to make sure I give these questions to Andrew where he's got great answers for them. So the next one is, when you change a landscape from grass to rock or a hardscape or a xeriscape, what does that do in terms of heat? Is that creating a heat sink? Are you increasing the amount of energy you need to cool your home in the summer months? Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say maybe let's revisit that at the end, just because I know we're already at the hour mark and I want to make sure we have enough time to get through. So that's a great question. If we have time, let's go ahead and chat about it some more at the end, just because it can end up being more lengthy discussion.
Okay, fabulous. So we'll pause here and then I will respond to those of you in the chat and on the Q&A section.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions and your engagement. This is awesome. This topic is so hard to narrow down exactly what to talk about because there is so much, and you all are asking some really great questions. So thank you. Okay, so let's talk briefly about contractors, landscape contractors. So what are some key things to take home? And there might be some landscape contractors on the line, and if so, that's awesome. It's a pretty late day for you if that's the case. And I used to work in landscape contracting as well. So there's quite a few challenges. This could be its whole own presentation, but we're just going to focus on an overall approach and some water specific strategies. So there's a difference between landscape maintenance and landscape management. So one of the things you can do as a community management or leadership is it's okay to ask the why behind specific practices or recommended practices, especially if you have a new contractor. They might be suggesting something that sounds new or different than you've ever experienced, but it might be addressing something related to deferred maintenance, or especially if it's around water. If you're trying to get someone on board who really understands water and maybe that wasn't happening in the past, then they might have some more intentionality around creating a proactive plan in place to adjust irrigation, look for hidden leaks. That's definitely something you're going to want to ask them about, rather than, so that's more the landscape management side, rather than if it's just simply maintenance or if it's just reaction. Then if it's more of just if there's an issue, we'll respond to it, even if it's really timely response and good response. If that's the only thing that's happening, then that's kind of a key difference to really kind of peel back the layers a little bit and ask about and work with your contractor about. So I really understand, are we managing our landscape or are we just kind of keeping it going and then putting out fires? And your landscape contractor is the one who has the knowledge, they have the power, the tools, they have the people to really to pivot and do those things. So I would definitely encourage you, they're your partner in this, right? So I would encourage you to have that discussion with them in an honest way and kind of see what they would recommend for your specific landscape in terms of kind of a longer term landscape management plan. And if you already have this in place, then that's really excellent. You're already doing a great job. For HOA communities, I would say the larger the HOA, the more frequently I tend to see that relationship. Those really medium to small HOAs, it's just really challenging to find a contractor who is affordable, who also can give you that service. So it might be a little bit of your own effort and combined with your contractor's effort. But that being said, it's still important to do. This is a big thing. We touched upon it a little bit. Proper plant care equals water efficiency. So that picture on the right, if you recognize that plant, then or let's say you recognize what that looks like. If you look at that and you're like, man, I wish our side looked like that. I could almost guarantee you that you actually have that plant in your landscape, because almost every single community in the West Valley, in Phoenix, has this plant. And if you have never seen it look like this, that means that it's probably improper plant care. And that's because it was trimmed too heavily. So desert plants, to ensure that they thrive, they require 10, especially established ones. They don't require a lot of water, but too much trimming can reduce that plant life. One of the challenges obviously related to that is you could have some actual overgrowth. But again, working with your contractor to say, hey, how can we help with this issue? We're getting plants that are maybe too big for this area. What can we do? Should we take them out? Or can we just trim them all the way back down to the ground? A lot of plants, you can do that in certain times of year, usually in late winter, early spring. And then what they'll do is they'll come back again from the very beginning at the bottom of the plant. And then by the time you need to trim them again, they won't be in the way, or they won't be a hazard or blocking visibility or things like that. And what that usually means in summary is selective trimming for plants instead of just monthly trimming, or we're here, so we're trimming. That's a different mentality than let's do what we have to do for the health of the plant. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in the next section as well, but identify the areas. You as the community leadership, you really do have the authority, I guess you could say, to identify what are priority areas for you. And then work with your contractor to maximize the contract you have in place so that those areas are getting the care that they deserve. And what that might look like is, hey, we have an area that's really high traffic, really visible. We want to maintain that to this really high standard. But this other area, we have a perimeter wall that's in the back, like nobody goes there. The plants are established. Like don't worry about checking that out. And the reason that I talk about this in this way, in terms of having a conversation with your contractor, is contractors are generally going to think in hours of labor. So especially if they have a contract with you, they're thinking, okay, well, how many hours is it going to take for me to maintain this landscape? And the hours are based on, how much square footage do we have? How much do we need to maintain this area? And so they're going to be thinking in, okay, how much do we need to do just get this done, to get our maintenance done, to make sure that we're still in a good place with this contract, right? Because it doesn't do anybody any good if they're losing money, you're going to get poor service. So it's really just kind of coming together and saying, this is our contract. We'd really like you to focus on these areas, put more hours towards this and less hours towards this. Can we work within that? And that way you're going to get the results that you want, rather than just kind of a, medium maintenance over the whole community. And ultimately what you want to do with your contractor for all of these things we talked about today is to build that trust. And again, if you feel like you're sitting in this call and you're like, we have a good relationship with our contractor, we really feel like we can bring these types of issues, we can work with them on water, then excellent job. Maybe talk with your other neighboring communities who maybe struggle with that. But this can be a challenge, and a lot of it comes down to, like we talked about earlier, it's just that communication piece. It's different languages that we're speaking, and we're not always on the same page, but a lot of times the goals are actually aligned. We talk with a lot of contractors that really do care a lot about water management and proper landscape management. We go to those conferences with them, sitting side by side on the water side. And so it's really just about coming together and building that trust so that you can keep those goals aligned. A couple other notes: really take a look at frequency of watering adjustments. So it's kind of one of those in deep practical things. So many controllers that we see are left unchanged or untouched for 3 to 6 months at a time. And that sometimes is not always the contractor's fault. That could be issues with access. So we have controllers that are in an area that's really hard to get to, or it's behind a locked gate that somehow nobody has the key. Or like we talked about earlier, those solar controllers, some of those have these special things you have to bring every time in order to program it. It's like, oh, I forgot the little special magic key that it needs, and now I can't program it. So those are some of the things that you maybe want to have a discussion about. But these are going to be really important for water efficiency and plant health overall. How frequently are the watering adjustments being made? Your overall irrigation system condition, we've talked about this as well. Just kind of another example, you'll look at this and take a quick glance at it, and maybe through this presentation, you could probably identify some things already that are not so great about this area here. And it's kind of like, okay, well, why? What's going on here? And just kind of taking a closer look at the hardware and saying, what are some things that we need to address in this situation? Do we want to keep this area? Do we need to upgrade the hardware in order that it can water efficiently? Are we, this was actually taken right after a nice rainfall too. So are we watering at times that we don't need to water? You know, there's a lot of things that can be going on. Another thing that does come up as well is on the irrigation side is how many zones no longer work. And that sometimes could be a very hidden issue. Your contractor might know that, like, oh yeah, we have several zones that just don't turn on anymore. And if you are in the community and you maybe can't tell which areas those are, hey, maybe that's some good insight that do we even need to address this, or are these plants surviving on rainfall? Can we just take that water savings and run with it? Maybe take note of those zones, that areas of your community that as experiments a little bit, that maybe you can decide, hey, we can actually turn off some zones, you know, more or less permanently, except for emergencies, because really they're doing fine. They're established. We don't need to water them anymore. Kind of talking a little bit more about water management strategies, which zones that you have, which areas are least efficient versus most efficient, and focusing your efforts on those. So maybe you don't need to do a community-wide upgrade project for everything all over. That's pretty overwhelming. Maybe just start with where are we losing the most water? And I'll give you a nice little tip here. Start with your drip irrigation zones. Our lawn zones are very visible. They're usually managed pretty closely. And a lot of times they're actually watering fairly efficiently. Where we see a lot of inefficiency is in those drip zones. So I would encourage you to start there. From the water management side, working with your contractor, have a discussion with them and say, how are we planning to stay within our estimated water budget? Because they're really the ones who are most empowered to make those decisions on a consistent basis. So if you can really sit down with them and say, hey, here's our water budget. You know, we worked with the city or the water agency, and you know, and we see that we're, you know, trending above it. How can we? What changes do you think we can make as, you know, you as the landscape contractor? How do you plan to kind of stay within our estimated budget now that you have this information? Because remember, they didn't have the information before. They can't get it unless you give it to them. And then the question that you would want to ask as community leadership or management is, what resources or access do you need from us to help you make this happen? Right? If you have a landscaper that can do this and they're empowered to do it, they might have some things that they need in order to make it happen. Here's a couple of resources I want to point out. Smartscape.org is a great place to find landscapers if you're kind of in the market. Also, this is on waterfluence.com. They have something called a landscape leaderboard. And this is a software program that a lot of cities use for water efficiency tracking. Just make sure you select in the top right Maricopa County, because it's kind of all over the West, this platform. But basically, it just kind of ranks contractors more or less live over of which ones have communities that they're watering close to water budget. So if that's something that's a really high priority for you, then maybe it's the place to start. A little caveat here is a lot of these contractors will, because they're so good at water management, especially your top 20 or so, they pick up communities that had issues before. So then when they get onto that, it drops their score, but it'll bring them up eventually once they have the site for a year or two. But anyway, just another resource for you. So let's talk a little bit about drought and landscape. So this presentation is a little more holistic, but we'll touch upon this because I'm sure it's something that's, you know, of concern. So let's talk a little bit about Colorado River shortage. If you're in the West Valley, either directly or indirectly, you're likely utilizing Colorado River in some respect, whether it's, I say, directly or indirectly. So you could be using groundwater, but that groundwater is replenished by Colorado River water, et cetera. So we won't get into the details here, but there are going to be some cuts across the whole Western United States for anybody that uses Colorado River water. So whether we really want to be or not, if you are managing large landscapes or you're in the landscape industry, really you are the first responders in a way to managing water curtailment in those times. So you want to check with your individual water provider to know if that's something that's kind of on the horizon for you. But the good news is, that's what I'm going to give you today, is some tools that are empowering for you as individual communities, so you can be prepared no matter what happens with your provider. So one thing I would encourage you to do is check on your water agencies or water providers' drought preparedness plan. So we all, as water agencies, have to have one required by law by the state to say, if we are in a situation as providers where we have some water resource strains or whatever, how are we going to respond? And sometimes our response is there are different sectors of water use. And so just look on there and see, okay, if we are an HOA community or a large community that has landscape, what's something that could be potentially asked of us? And that's what we're going to be referencing if we're going to be coming and asking you about some assistance in that category. So one thing that I would encourage you to do is think about creating your own community preparation plan for drought. So regardless of anything that's happening with your specific water provider, whether you've heard anything specific or not, this is going to give you some certainty for your HOA's, your landscape future for your HOA. You can preserve as many plants as possible. You can really dig into having that proactive approach to irrigation system management and water management. And it's really going to be able to give you that power to communicate with your residents who maybe don't have all the information about what's going on. They might just see things happening, and really kind of help build that trust up with the residents that are living within your community. So really, it's going to be a great communication tool if you can come up with a guideline for yourself, working with your contractor, your board, management, and even maybe input from the community if you feel it's appropriate, of what to expect in your specific landscape in this situation. I'll dig in just briefly into what this might look like for you, because it's kind of a newish topic. But think again about prioritizing your areas. What are your high value trees and high use parks that you really don't want to see suffer in times of water curtailment? Remember that Bermuda grass and desert plants can survive drought. They can bounce back from that. So your Bermuda grass is your summer grass. So even if they have to go drought dormant, they can most of the time come back. So ask your contractor about this. And if the plan or the response is, we'll just reduce minutes on all the zones, that's, as we talked about earlier, it's going to inhibit that deep watering, and you're going to end up just having everything suffering a bit rather than just maybe a couple areas. So what I would encourage you to do is focus on two things: water consumption in gallons, that's where you need your water budget, and communication. What actions are we taking? And then how are we going to let the people in our community know about it? So what should be in the plan? I know I'm getting a little close to our time, so I'll just go run through some of these things, but I can stay and answer questions as long as needed. I would like, one thing you might like to do is, and this is generally how cities will think as well, is think of specific actions you're going to take in your community for, let's say, 10%, 20%, 30%. Start in those areas. That's not to say that that's what's going to be asked of you, but if you have a plan already in place, it's not going to be so scary. They're like, that's okay. They can ask us for up to 30% of reduction on our landscape watering, and we know exactly what we're going to do to keep our community still fine. And you're going to identify an annual goal and a monthly goal. So let's say, hey, for year 2024, we need you to reduce water by 20%, versus, hey, for next month, can you reduce water by 20%? Those are two different things from a management side. So I'd encourage you to take a look at both of those and work with your contractor on that, because they're the ones who are going to be able to know the specific watering changes that are possible in those areas. And then, of course, we talked about, again, I can't drive this point home enough, communicate what you're thinking of, especially if you have a plan in place, share it with your residents. So that way, let's say you have to make a change and say, we're going to stop watering this park, but we're also going to let everybody in our community know. We send them a postcard, we put it on our community forum. Everybody has the information that, hey, by the way, this park is not watered because we're trying to meet our water curtailment goals. So again, prioritize your areas, identify those high value trees. Oh, sorry, looks like I've got a little bit of repeat here, but proactive irrigation management, utilizing rainfall. This goes back to, if we might still be in a situation where we say, we need to reduce our watering by 10%, but if we just respond to, like this last summer, we had quite a bit of rain. If we just responded to every rainfall event, you might save this at 10% that way. So again, this point as well, excuse me. I'm just putting one example community up here so you can see what this might look like for you if you're trying to start down this path and say, okay, what areas would be a high priority area for us? Well, if this was your community, you might decide, well, this area right here is our entryway, right? They're desert plants, but really, this is a high value area. Everybody sees this who comes into the community, visitors and residents. We really want to keep this area looking good. We don't want to cut our water back here if at all possible. This park, This is like our central one. A lot of people use this one. It's our heavily used area. So we also, this is going to be one of the last areas that we want to decide to reduce our water consumption, right? So if we're asked to cut 10 or 15%, we're not going to do it in these areas. And maybe over here, let's say we have some really nice, big, mature, established trees, right? They're not necessarily like right in the middle of something, but they might say, hey, these are high value trees for us. They provide a lot of benefit. In this area, we want to maintain these. And then you might say, okay, well, what areas can we kind of let go in the instance, or just reduce them? What areas can take a little bit of strain? Well, you might take a look at these. These are just big basins that aren't even really accessible to people. So maybe they're not really going down there. They're not active recreation areas. You can see even this particular community decided not to overseed those areas. And it's Bermuda grass. So you might say, hey, these are hard to water anyway. They're going to get some rainfall falling in there. Let's just decide to reduce our water consumption here. And it may not even be turning them all the way off. It might just be, hey, let's just reduce these areas by 30%. And that's going to get us the water we need because they're so huge areas that we're going to get a lot of gallons there. And then you might say, hey, this park way up here is just out of the way. It's not even, almost in our community. So we're just going to also decide on that one. We're not going to overseed it. We're going to reduce it, not as much as our basins, but to an extent. And this is how we're going to accomplish our percentage water savings goals. And what that might look like, here's a sample of a template. You just say, okay, if we need to take some actions month over month, this is what that looks like specifically. If we need to take some actions based on our overall water budget, this is what that looks like. So one thing I would definitely encourage to do is, and I'd be happy to share this template with anybody, here on the call. Maybe we can include it in the email. We had a community here in Goodyear that really took this to heart and did a really excellent job with their plan. Even though we don't have any requirements in place, we're asking everybody just get prepared, and that way if it happens, it won't be a surprise. But after you complete this, send it to your water provider. And the reason I say this is because if there's a time where maybe we hear more about specific watering restrictions, like you hear about in Nevada and California, then you could say, well, here we're going to be taking actions to actually reduce our consumption in gallons. So can we maybe get an exemption from specific watering day restrictions, which for large communities usually isn't appropriate anyway, because you're managing such a large landscape. It's not really possible to irrigate what you need to in specific days. So to sum up that, scenario one, there's no plan. There's a curtailment ask from a city or water provider. There's a lot of panic. There's potential plant death, and there's a lot of residents who are maybe kind of upset. Scenario two is what we talked about just now, having a plan in place. We're going to talk with our residents. We're going to share it with the water provider. You might actually lose little to no plants, especially those desert plants. They're tougher than we give them credit for. You have a lot more trust that's built now. The board and the property management, you guys look brilliant. And you keep checking for those leaks and still saving water and being proactive. Last point, and then I'll open it up for any questions for anybody. I know we've gone pretty close to our time. So what does this mean for you specifically? So one thing as I go through these, I would just recommend, we've covered so much information today. And if a lot of it sounds familiar to you, awesome. You're already on the road to Water Hero. If a lot of it was new, don't worry, don't panic. What I'm going to encourage you to do is think about your specific community and think about which of these things we covered today is most relevant to apply, and then go back and pick just one area to start focusing on. It can get really overwhelming quickly. So just pick one of the things that seems to resonate the most with you and start chipping away at that. So for property managers, and I'll give you some recommendations. If you're a property manager, look at your data. Measure the water use against the expected water budget. Ask for your water provider for help in this, because we can sometimes just kind of get you all that in one lump sum. If all you have are paper bills, definitely work with your water provider. If you already have the data or you have a kind of a billing management system that you use, you might be able to do this yourself. But if you need the water provider's help to provide the expected water use, then feel free to reach out to us, right? I wouldn't expect you to come up with an irrigation calculation for plant water need. So I would say this would be a big takeaway if you're not already doing this. If you're a board member, be the water hero. This is really your home, right? This community that you live in, this is your home, and you are the true owner of this. You might have some really trusted partners in your property manager and your contractor, but really this comes down to you in the long run. So what I would encourage you to do is start thinking about, if you haven't already, identifying your most and least important areas. So that could be, what is our most important area for water efficiency upgrades? And what are our most important areas that if we have to take some, if we have to cut back on some water consumption overall, what areas do we want to make sure we prioritize that keep the water? And what areas can we kind of live without, or just kind of experiment with them and see how they do? If you're a landscape contractor, what I would encourage you to do is have some straightforward communication strategies about your best management practices for optimal plant health. So a lot of times, if you feel like you're having to do a lot of actions that aren't really in the best interest of the landscape as a whole, then I would encourage you to kind of try and get creative in communicating how those decisions might impact the landscape in the long run and how it's impacting water efficiency, right? If you're having to trim something way more often, then this is the time to have that conversation and say, well, we can certainly do that. However, here are the risks, right? It's going to decrease our plant health, and it's going to increase our water need. And advocate for those water efficient practices. If you're somebody who's here, you probably are already doing good at that. But if you're kind of in that phase of learning about what are the best things that we can do for water efficiency, continue to advocate for those and support your board and your property manager for those communities you manage when they are looking to make decisions like that. And if you're a community resident that doesn't have a leadership position, but you're just really interested in this topic, again, be the eyes and ears for those hidden issues, and then advocate for water management and support the leadership within your community that's doing it. If you're someone who likes to have those discussions with your board, if you're going to do that, just do it really respectfully, especially when you see issues arise. Because a lot of us, everybody just really trying to do their best a lot of times, and sometimes things kind of get under the radar or they just get missed. So communicating that in a respectful way can sometimes go a really long way, again, for kind of building that trust. But your advantage is to advocate, since you are the voter in a community, advocate for the people who are really doing this in a leadership perspective. And then help your neighbors. If you're seeing that they have some issues, or you're getting really well versed in water and water efficiency, help your neighbors that maybe don't have this or don't have the time to look into these types of things. And if you're a water agency or a city like myself and some other folks here on the call, what we need to be able to do is help to foster these relationships with our communities and be available for our HOA. So when any of you as community members and leadership reach out and you have questions and you have concerns, it's our responsibility to be able to have that conversation with you and answer those in as honest a way as we can. Sometimes we don't have all the information, especially with relation to things like the Colorado River. So we can tell you what we know. Sometimes it's not super satisfying, but it is something that's our responsibility to keep you in the loop and keep you informed, so that, and if you feel like you're missing some information or you want to know more about, say, hey, how is the drought preparedness plan that you have going to impact us? That's a good discussion to have. And I would encourage you to reach out and have those discussions. And that is the sum of my presentation. Thank you all very much for sitting through that. I feel like I talked quite a bit there, so hopefully you took away a couple of things. Here are a couple other resources for you. If you aren't familiar with these, definitely check out those websites. Your water provider as well might be able to provide you some hard copies of those things. So some of this is related to large landscapes, a lot of it's related to small landscapes, but the principles are all the same. So thank you all very much, and I will turn it back over to Amanda and Rick for anybody else who has some questions. I'd be happy to stay as long as needed.
Yes, I'm just going to say there are a few questions. So there was one. Do you have any knowledge on products that work to increase water retention in soil? So there was an example of, is there something that's actually effective that, it'll reduce watering by up to 50%? Are these kind of snake oil products, or is there something that actually works and reduces your water use?
That's a great question. There's a study that's ongoing right now at ASU on one of their athletic fields that they are experimenting with a product like this that increases retention of the water within the soil. In most areas in the West Valley, depending on where you are exactly, if you're closer to the river or not, if you're in an area that has some clay and clay loam soil, that soil already has a really high water holding capacity. So adding in a product, it's not, you don't really need that per se. Your soil already has a really high water holding capacity. It's not moving through the soil that quickly. If you have a soil that is draining, like a sandier soil, right? Maybe if you're really close to like if you're a river or something like that, or if you're up against one of the mountains, your community, and you have areas that the water percolates really, really fast, you could try experimenting with that. One thing to be careful with those products is just because it holds the water in the soil doesn't mean it's accessible to the plant roots. So you could end up holding a bunch of water in the soil and like, hey, it's holding all this water, and the plants are still like, yeah, I can't get it. It's holding it too tight. So that's something to consider for those products, to really make sure that it's actually in line with the type of soil that you have. I would say if you're anywhere kind of in the general valley area and not close to a riverbed, the clay loam soil already has a really good high water holding capacity. So that type of product probably won't really do much for you. If you have a sandier soil, you could experiment with it in some smaller areas. Usually you'll see that related to lawn. If you have desert plants, you know, they're adapted to our soils in our area, and the desert adapted plants, you don't really need that for them. If you have lawn in an area that is, you know, drains like that, and it's hard to keep that lawn, and we do have some areas like this in the area, I mean, in the West Valley, then you might consider experimenting with it. I don't believe you're going to save a really high consumption of water. That's really dependent on the fact if you were overwatering it by that much, right? Remember, going back to our landscape water budget, what our goal is to apply the right amount of water to our lawn, to our landscapes. But if you're thinking lawn specifically, so if you are only applying 10 or 15% more than you need, and then you get this product in there, well, that's really the room you have for savings, right? Because the lawn is using the rest of that water. So you're not going to save 50%, otherwise you're now underwatering the lawn. So just something to keep in mind. You really want to start with your data, start with your budget, and that's going to help you identify, do we have other issues that are happening on our landscape that can get us that additional savings? Is it really a soil issue, or is it other issues contributing to that overwatering? So it's a good question. But yeah, anytime you have like a silver bullet product or anything like that, when it comes to landscape management, it's rare that you're going to get one type of product that's going to get you all the savings you need, right? That's why we talked about this today. It's because it is complicated, not overly complicated, but it's complex enough that really we're talking about landscape management. And so all these factors play into it, and one piece of technology or strategy isn't really going to do everything for you. It's a combination of these different things. But yeah, really great question. I would say do your due diligence related to your specific community. And anytime you have a vendor coming to you like that, what we always ask them at the cities, because we have this happening to us all the time, water agencies and cities, we ask them for, do they have a pilot already in place in the valley that they can show us? And I would encourage you to do the same as a community and say, okay, that sounds great. Can you tell us about some other communities, and can we talk to them that are using this? And then if they don't call you back, then you got your answer.
Okay. And then we've had lots of questions about, can we get a copy of this presentation? And I've been saying it will be posted on westvalleywater.org. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so. We'll work. I don't know the exact timeline, but hopefully by the end of this week, I think we'll probably be able to get that. I don't know about the recording yet, but certainly the slides. Yeah.
Okay. So slide deck will be up there, and then hopefully recording at some point. Okay. I'm going to go back to a question that was a little while ago. It said, when they cut back watering on their lawn area, tree roots destroyed irrigation pipes. How can you prevent that?
Yeah, interesting. So a lot of times you'll see some of those invasive tree roots. It could depend on the tree type that you have as well. Some trees are a little more prone to that than others, but a lot of times something can happen on the tree roots where they'll come to the surface a lot for a couple of reasons. Sometimes they are trying to access water because that's where the water is. But a lot of times if there's too much water in the area, like let's say there was a tree in lawn, and if that lawn was overwatered, then tree roots also need oxygen. So if there was very little oxygen there, then you're going to have a lot of these tree roots coming to the surface because they're trying to access oxygen in addition to water without drowning out and without rotting. So that could have been an effect from before. If then you reduced your water use and now you're seeing it, it could be those tree roots are really just, they're hunting for all the best water. So a solution to that essentially is to do some extremely deep watering on those trees as much as you can, especially if you're really like, hey, I don't want to tear it out, then what I would encourage you to do is get some irrigation, even if it's a temporary irrigation system installed, if you're thinking of your home, or even if you're thinking of a large community, you might be able to kind of coordinate something like this, work with your contractor. They make, these essentially drip irrigation lines that have holes within the line. We see this in all different parts of the country. We don't see it so much in Arizona, but we call it inline drip emitters, or even something like a soaker hose, as simple as a soaker hose. If it's just one or two trees, if you have a bunch of them that are doing that and you want to get that deep watering, what I encourage you to do is maybe install a temporary system at minimum to kind of really kind of get that area, really deeply soak it, and then let it dry out, really deeply soak it again, let it dry out. So that what you're doing is you're helping promote those deeper roots to kind of go back down into the soil as much as possible. If you have structural roots that are up at the top, I mean, that you're not going to be able to do much about at that point. But if you're getting a lot of the little suckers and stuff like that, then really trying to get that deeper root depth by those really deep and infrequent waterings on those established trees. And again, going back to our lawn removal thing, if you remove lawn, then you're really going to want to do that for those trees, because they're going to start getting a little more aggressive, especially in those first couple of years that you do that, to try and stay alive, essentially. And there was another question about, which I just want to make sure I don't forget, about the urban heat type of thing, if you're removing lawn and replacing it with rock. And that's definitely something, there's been a lot of studies related to that as well. I don't remember exactly the name of it, but I think ASU did a couple of studies related specifically to that topic. I mean, it's something to consider, right? If for us in the desert, we have some choices. We want a lot of evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling takes water. So if we're trying to do water efficiency and save water, and we don't want to spend a bunch of money on that, then you're going to reduce your evaporative cooling to an extent. So one thing that you can try, because the rock mulch is very common, right? It's just kind of what we do. We just put rock mulch anywhere that we have areas that we've taken out lawn. It's very stable. It doesn't break down so quick, so it's lower maintenance. But one thing you can consider to help with that, if you're concerned about that, is to do a organic mulch. It's not something we see so often here in the desert, but it is something that what it does in organic mulch is just, it's not rock. It's more like think of like a bark and things like that. And you can use that in some areas, and that will help to keep that moisture in the soil longer than a rock mulch will. And because it's organic material, it's going to cool down quicker, just like any organic material, plant material would. And you can kind of experience this if you go out in the further edges of the desert, go out Wickenburg and beyond. And at night, they're going to have that cooler effect, not because they have a bunch of lawn they're watering, right? But because it's a natural desert. They don't have as much of that hardscape. So it's really more about all the concrete and the hardscape that we have that causes a little more of that, our streets and pavement. But you can help to mitigate that a little bit if you are open to doing the more organic mulch. The reason you don't see it so much is because you have to replace it more frequently. So there's a little more cost, and it doesn't look as clean. So a lot of folks don't really like it as much because it doesn't keep its nice tidy shape like rock mulch does. So, but it's a consideration, right? That if you're a community trying to make that decision, if you're really trying to avoid those effects of urban heat, then I would encourage you maybe try it in some small areas, see how you like it. If you're removing lawn in some small areas, try the organic mulch, especially if you have established trees that you want to keep. It's much better for them to have that organic mulch because it's going to retain moisture in that soil longer. So yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely something to consider. But I would say something to maybe, not get so hung up on that it paralyzes you, right? Like, well, we don't want we're just going to keep, watering this lawn over and over, just to help prevent this. And another thing too, to keep in mind is in the middle of summer when it's really hot and you walk outside, where are you going if you're trying to avoid the heat? You're not going to the middle of the lawn just because it's lawn. You're going to the tree where there's shade. So if you want to really help mitigate that, consider maybe planting 1 or 2 additional trees. Even if you have the rock mulch, you say, okay, we really just want to get our shade canopy up, is what we want to do. And really try to get as much density of shade canopy as we can with desert trees. And then we can still kind of have our cake and eat it too a little bit. We have less water going out there, but we're still getting that somewhat cooler effect because that ground just never heats up to the extent that an exposed rock ground would. But yeah, great question.
Another question is, do you know anything about Carapia, the grass alternative?
Oh, I've heard about it. I don't know enough off the top of my head today to speak to it. so if you're looking for lawn alternatives or different varieties of lawn, the resource that I would recommend looking at is the University of Arizona Extension Office. They also have a turf grass school. I don't know if it's still active anymore, but they do have a ton of research that they've done in the past. They have a turf research center down there, and they published a lot of material related to different alternatives for lawn. A lot of it is surrounding golf courses because that's where lawn is essentially the business, right? But you can apply some of that to community landscapes as well. You could try some lawn alternatives. I mean, if you have a large community that has Bermuda grass, common Bermuda grass, typically that's the reason you see it so frequently is it's one of our most efficient and drought tolerant types of lawns out there. If you start moving into some of those other varieties, they can be effective. However, a lot of them don't tolerate foot traffic. So keep that in mind if you have an area that is larger and people kind of frequent and they walk on and stuff. If you have an area that's purely visual, maybe near a monument sign, you might decide to experiment with some of those other varieties that are lower water use. I will say one thing I've noticed in some areas that seems to look nice from afar, but you can't tell till you get up close that it's not lawn, is a Myoporum. It's a ground cover that stays pretty low. Doesn't work everywhere, but in the areas that it does work, it can have that kind of thick mat, and it's just a ground cover. So it might have a little bit higher water requirement than just a desert shrub, but it's certainly going to be a lower water requirement than even a Bermuda grass lawn. So there are a few things out there like that. That specific one that you mentioned, Amanda, I don't have enough familiarity on that one to speak to, but I would search that term and then search U of A and see if they have any research already on it.
Thank you. Someone did ask if they could see the landscape water budget again. So I don't know if you can go back in your slides to.
Yeah, I certainly can. Let me just go back here to, I'm guessing they mean the graphs themselves, and I can definitely go back to that. And yeah, if you are, depending on your water provider today, you can definitely reach out to me or Amanda. I think I have my email was at the end, but I can share it in the chat here. And even if it's not your provider, if Goodyear's not your provider, I can connect you with the right person. So feel free to reach out to me. Put my email in the chat here. Let's see here. Go back a few more. Probably this one, I'm guessing. So did they have a question related to that?
It was. Let me see. No, I think it was actually just can we see the budget? I gotta go back. It was.
Yeah, well, I'll leave it here in case they want to put the question in the chat, but I put my email in there. So if any of you are trying to find out how you can get this information started for your community, you can reach out to me and just let me know, if you know your water provider, just let me know. If you don't know your water provider per se, but you know what city you're in, obviously, then you can let me know and I'll connect you with the right people.
Can we go over the equation again to figure out your budget? So it's actually the.
Oh yeah, we got somebody who likes the math. Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to this one. So the equation right here. So I'm guessing this one here. So these are the three pieces of information that you need. I know we kind of went through it fairly quickly. There are three pieces of information that you need to create your landscape water budget. The first one actually that I would get if I was you starting is your landscape area, because this is just your square footage. Your contractor might already have this. If not, this platform right here that you're seeing, this is just Google Earth based. So you can actually download Google Earth on your, if you have a computer, and you can measure this landscape yourself. It takes a lot of work, but you can actually do it and get that yourself. And that's the first piece of information that we always get on the utility side. The next piece of information that you need is the plant type. So that's kind of, for the most part, I would just keep it simple, break it down between lawn and non-lawn. There's really not too much else in a really large scale water budget that you need to worry about. So just figure out what's lawn, what's not lawn. And then everything else, if you have a lake, measure that separately because you're going to account for evaporation on your lake. But if not, that's the other piece of information you need. The third piece of information is weather. Now, this is where us from the water utility side can assist because we use different weather stations that are around. Some of them are built into a software that we can share with you, or they're built into that Excel sheet that you saw before on the other slide. And it's based on our weather in our area. So sometimes people get a little bit mixed up in terms of saying, well, if it's, we have like, you gave me my water budget, but we have like a lot of lawn, like we have a lot of lawn. Well, that's a water budget, right? You've got the landscape size, it's accounting for that. So if you do your landscape measurement, then that is that piece of information right there. The other piece of information you need after you've got that all together is it's going to spit out for you the water use in gallons. So then what else do you need? Well, now we need our actual gallons, right? Then that takes us back to this one. Oh, I guess it's on the other slide. Once you have your gallons, you need that in order to compare the two numbers. So we can create the budget that's going to get you your green line here. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not. Oops. Maybe not anymore. Sorry, losing my mouse. Here we go. So if you can see my mouse, this green line, that the calculation gets you that. In order to get the blue line, that's where you need to either go through your bills that you have and get those input, or work with your water provider to get that information. If you have, let's say, it doesn't matter if you have one water meter or if you have 25 water meters. This is all lumped together. So you can go water meter by water meter if you know, let's say, you know, I'll go back to this. Sorry, I'm flipping around a lot, but it's a good question to be clear on. Let's say, you know, like in this case, there's one water meter here that waters just this area. You can break your whole community down that way. If you actually know this meter only waters this area, you can create budgets for each individual area. It's a lot of work. So I would recommend just starting holistically, right? Just let's lump everything in together. And then if you're above budget, then you can start to dig into individual meters and say, okay, which one of these seems extra high? Or which one of these spiked up recently? Then you can really start to dig into it. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Perfect. Any other questions? I don't see any others in the chat or in the Q&A section. Andrew's email is in the chat. Mine is also in the chat. You can reach out to either one of us and we can connect you with pretty much anyone you would need. And Rick, do you have anything else to add?
I'm putting my email in the chat as
Okay.
well.
Perfect.
I just saw one question. I can't tell. It looks like, Rick, you might be answering it. Someone asked about a lot of residents want the green grass, regardless of how much it costs or water. So, or should I let you finish any answer? It looked like it said you were typing.
I started to type an answer to that, and you know, it's really unfortunate, and it's not an unusual attitude. I've seen it in a lot of places, and it's
definitely
very
yeah.
discouraging.
Well, one thing, you know, you really, as community members, you know, it's really is your community, right? We as water providers can kind of encourage direction and things like that, but it really is up to the community as a whole. And like a lot of things in just kind of general voting, right? It's majority kind of takes
Yeah.
that rule, right? But one thing you can do is you can lead by example, right? And this is something that's been measured in a lot of very interesting ways. That if, let's say, you have a home that's maybe a little bit older home and has a lot of lawn in front, and you decided, you know what, I'm going to take that out and put in a really nice desert landscape, like just like a really nice one, you know, because I like the gardening, or I like the yard, and I really like the desert. What has been proven a lot of times over in a lot of these communities, especially like in HOAs, because houses are so similar and yards are so similar, is I don't know what it's called, like the keeping up with the Joneses effect or something, but somebody else sees that and they're like, wow, that's
pressure.
Really nice. Yeah, it's like, it's the copycat thing, you know, it's like, wow,
Yeah.
that's really nice. I never thought a desert landscape could look that nice. And then all of a sudden you start to see a whole block transform, you know, and it doesn't take that long, right? Because they're like, hey, we were thinking about that, we just didn't really know where to start or whatever, like how much did it cost you, right? And all of a sudden now you're somebody who's advocating for that, even if it's maybe not all the way at that community level. So I would say start small, start in your own little yard, and start to build up that kind of attitude in a positive way, right? Rather than, you know, it's very difficult, especially these last couple of years, anytime we're coming at an angle and saying, coming at things from a place of lack, right? A lot of us are tired of things being taken away. So that's a hard place to start. It's like, it's just another thing, right? So coming at it from a different angle of like, no, it's actually more, it actually makes my life better, right? I don't have to worry about all this lawn. It's so much maintenance, so much water. The costs are only going up. I get to have a really nice yard that I love that's lower maintenance and cost me less. Who wouldn't want that? So now you can really start to transition that conversation that it's actually upgrading your life. It's actually upgrading your community. It's actually upgrading the long-term vision for what your community can be, not just in your own little yard, but as a community as a whole. So I think I would say if you find that you're fighting that battle, maybe turn it around a little bit to try, if as much as possible, to be a positive, to say, hey, maybe we can upgrade this area that we're not using. Not a lot of people go here, or in our industry we famously kind of call it a dog poop areas, right? Like, this lawn area is really just for dog poop. Can we transition that? Because it's really, we don't want to just see that area just used for that, right? Can we upgrade it to something cool? And then you can really start to change that. So hopefully that helps, and it just kind of encourage you in that, and don't get too discouraged, especially if you're in a community that has a lot of seasonal visitors. It's a hard thing to break, right? Because people come here, it's not really maybe a home really per se. So there's not as much investment in kind of that resource side of things. But it doesn't mean that people don't care all the time. I mean, obviously you can have that, but it's rare that, like, I encounter people that just don't care, right? It's usually just the knowledge isn't all there, and it's maybe just, oh, I didn't realize we can have something that looks really nice that's not grass. I just have no experience with that because I am from another place that doesn't have anything else. So if you have that knowledge and you have that experience yourself, I would encourage you to share it by example as well. So hopefully that helps. I just want to respond to this. Someone asked about what is the C in the water budget equation. Oh yeah, sorry, I just completely ignored that. This is just a constant. It's just a math constant. That's all it is. So it's nothing you have to worry about in that way. This particular equation here, if you're interested in math and you like this stuff, if you go to irrigation.org, this is just it's a calculation that is used to calculate water budgets for all landscape irrigation, essentially. So you can find these specific numbers and how to input them on irrigation.org, and just look up calculations. That very first slide, if you were with us at the beginning, that I had of all those calculations, that's kind of where that's from. That actually all of these calculations for landscape water budgets came from agriculture originally. All these calculations of how much water do plants need came from agriculture. But one thing to keep in mind with that is built for production. Agriculture is for production. So what we do in our urban landscapes, even if you're watering exactly to what the budget says, it's still more or less overwatering, because we don't need to water our urban landscapes for production. We need to water them just for aesthetic or for community benefits, or helping with carbon dioxide and things like that. But we're not doing it for production. So just keep in mind, you have a little bit even more wiggle room than you think, even on these budgets. So
We have two more questions.
Sure.
And one of them is specific to you, Andrew, because of Goodyear. It says,
Okay.
is there a website, or can they get a website that shows the HOA requirements for trees in Goodyear? I don't know if you have a tree requirement for HOAs in Goodyear, but if you do, can you plop it in the chat?
Yeah, good question. I believe it's actually on our city code. I don't have that handy, but I would encourage you, if you could just, if you don't mind emailing me, I can send you the information on that. I would say if you're an existing community in Goodyear, I wouldn't worry too much about required densities. If you're thinking of, hey, we want to remove some lawn and put in some plants, it's not something that we're kind of like out there like, oh, you didn't put enough plants in. But there are some interesting rules, and maybe this is what they're alluding to, that communities themselves have for their residents. And that's not something the city actually requires. That's in your CC&R. So if you're a resident of a community that saying, yeah, the HOA is requiring me to put all these in. Sometimes people mix that up and saying the city's requiring me to put all that in. Generally, cities don't have requirements for number of plants in your yard. If that's a requirement, that's likely coming from your HOA. I can't speak for everybody, but that's been my experience for almost across the board, that cities kind of really don't care how many plants you have in your yard. It's more about the HOA that you live in. They have a requirement, and that is more of a discussion to have with your board and your HOA, your community, because the city actually can't really change that. That's within the CCNRs, and the CCNRs can only be changed by the board and the electeds within the community. So I'm not sure if that was the question, but yeah, if that's not, feel free to just shoot me an email and I can look for our code in Goodyear to find that specific plant requirement. But thank you, that's a good question.
And then there's a question that just popped up that says, what about fake grass? Is it worth it?
It depends on the area that you want to use it in. So, there's a lot of debate we hear about artificial grass. I think the way that, I personally kind of approach it is think of it like hardscape in the effect of how it performs. So if you're worried about like urban heat and things like that, it's going to act like let's say, oh, I put a patio in the back. I had lawn and I put it a concrete patio, or I put some pavers. Kind of lump artificial turf in that same category, right? In terms of how it performs on the landscape, because it's an artificial, it's not a natural, whatever you call it, material. If you're thinking about it, I don't see it that frequently in HOAs. And I think the reason is because of scale. It is very expensive per square foot. So if you're talking about large, like we're seeing in this picture here, there's no way artificial turf is it's just too expensive, right? It's prohibitively expensive to use artificial turf in a very large area. If you have those little small areas, let's say you have a monument sign and you have real grass in front of it, and the monument sign keeps getting calcified because the hard water is hitting it, that's a great place to put artificial turf, right? It's going to be green all the time. People driving by at 65 miles an hour on State Route 60 are not going to know the difference between artificial grass, and it's going to just look nice all the time, right? And it's going to be no maintenance, no water. That's a great place to put it. If you have an area that's used pretty actively, or like a really large basin, it's a hard sell because it's so expensive. And there's still maintenance that does go into it. It's typically not as much as lawn, but it still has some maintenance into it. So the question of, is it worth it? It really depends on the area that you have in mind. If you're thinking of just your own yard, a lot of times it can be really nice just to reduce maintenance costs. So that's really up to you. I would say a place that we see it be really good is if you have a big tree in the back that already gives you shade, but you can't really use the area under the tree because it's just like rock or like a bunch of grass that doesn't grow. Then you could put the artificial turf there. But again, going back to make sure you're giving that tree ample water, that's really important. Artificial lawn in some respects can be somewhat slightly more beneficial than just like a concrete patio, because you can actually have some infiltration. So you don't have runoff per se. You have a little bit of runoff, but you're still getting more infiltration than you would with just concreting something. So those are some of the things I would say to consider when you consider artificial turf. But yeah, it really kind of comes down to your specific area. It is really expensive, especially right now. I will admit that.
And just to reiterate, we will get the recording out. I'm just not sure the exact time frame. We're hoping probably by the end of the week we'll get slides up, but then we will have the recording available. All righty. Anything else? Fantastic. Well, you guys have a wonderful evening. It is just about 8:30, so we've used up your 2 hours, and you guys have a beautiful night. Again, if you need anything, please reach out by email. Andrew with Goodyear, I'm with Surprise, and Rick is with EPCOR. So
thanks everyone for tuning in.
Have a great night, guys.
Thank you everyone. Great engagement. Keep up the great work.